Today, I want to talk about subject to addendums. Um, so, for those investors out there that are watching this that intend to purchase property or do, in fact, purchase property subject to existing loans, um, I recommend that in addition to the purchase contract that lays out the terms of any type of seller carryback financing, wrap agreement, or otherwise, that if the property is being subject to the existing loans, that a subject to addendum be incorporated with and accompany that purchase contract. Now, what is a subject to addendum? So, a subject to addendum is basically an addition to the contract that lays out and discloses the exact nature of the transaction, as well as provides disclosures to the seller as to what it means to have the loans remain in place while the new buyer takes title to the property. One of the defenses that we've seen sellers use in dealing or try to use in trying to claim, well, I don't have to perform under the contract because I didn't fully appreciate or understand the nature of the subject to transaction. Well, the subject to addendum eliminates that, because the subject to addendum goes line by line with the seller, where the seller initials to basically explain that, and the seller acknowledges that they understand the nature of the transaction. So, for example, the seller understands that the loan is going to remain in place and still show on their credit. They understand that if the loan payments are not made um, by the buyer, that that's going to potentially cause damage to the credit. That the loan's not being paid off. That the seller, or not the seller, the lender may have a right to, at that point, if the property is transferred, have the right to invoke the due on sale clause, and what it means if the due on sale clause is invoked. So it has all of these disclosures that the seller basically initials, and they're one sentence disclosures, basically laying out the nature of the transaction, so that if the seller comes back later on and says, "Oh, I didn't fully appreciate that. I thought that I was just selling it outright, that this was being paid off, etc." Say, no, you signed a subject to addendum. You initialed each line here, which basically explained in detail and pretty simple terms the nature of this transaction, and you acknowledged and agreed that you understood, that you appreciated the transaction, and that you are aware of the nature and the risks of the transaction. So I recommend that anytime that a property is being purchased subject to, that there be some form of addendum accompanying that purchase contract that allows or has the seller make these acknowledgments and details and explains the transaction. But not only for the seller, but it's also beneficial for um, a buyer if that contract is going to be assigned. So a lot of times an investor will put a contract or put a property under contract with a subject to structure, with the idea that they're going to assign it to another investor who will then actually perform under the contract. And then that original buyer would take an assignment fee for the assignment to the end buyer. Well, you want to make sure that that end buyer fully understands and appreciates the nature of the transaction. And so if you do or put together a purchase contract, it has all of the seller carryback terms, et cetera, but it doesn't exactly lay out the nature of the subject to transaction, well, then that end buyer could come back and say, well, I didn't fully understand that it was subject to. I thought, that it was being paid off with seller carry, or whatever the case may be. But the subject to addendum contains all those disclosures. And so, as you and I know, an end buyer or an assignee of a contract basically takes the contract as though they were the original buyer. And so all those initials and all those signatures on that subject to addendum will be imputed and deemed to be knowledge of the end buyer. And the end buyer basically stands in the shoes of the original buyer and says, oh yeah, where the original buyer said, yeah, I understand the nature of the transaction as well, that end buyer is deemed to fully appreciate or understand the nature of the transaction.